So a few months back, I was invited onto Andres Restart's channel to do a live stream where we kind of debated whether or not the Switch 2 would release in 2024 or 2025. We were also joined by my buddy Tucker from Backlog Banter. It's a great stream. If you want to go back and watch that VOD, it is on his channel. But I realized, we compiled all this data for why we think it's releasing in 2025, and I realized I never made a video on it. So today I wanted to go over all of my reasonings for why I think the Switch 2 releasing in 2025 just makes way more sense than 2024. And as we go through, I have all of them written down as separate reasons. They will steadily get more and more granular when it comes to the stats and the data and sales information that we have officially from Nintendo. But starting off, I just want to kind of kick with this, right? The Nintendo Switch is on track to become the most successful Nintendo console of all time, if not the most successful console of all time. Why on earth would any business look at that? Why would they look at that and not replicate the release strategy used for it for their new console? I just can't wrap my head around why they would opt in to change up their marketing strategy for the successor to the Switch when the Switch is literally their most successful hardware, or like I said, will become their most successful hardware. I feel like that alone is a big reason that they would choose to release it in March versus, November or September, like a lot of people think 2024. March 2025, if they do that, it would replicate the exact release strategy of the Nintendo Switch back in 2017. Reason number 2, so traditionally you think of Nintendo consoles as releasing in the holiday season, right? You think of the NES and SNES, you think of the N64, although that was actually June in Japan. You think of the Wii U, you think of the Wii, right? Those are all holiday releases. But the Switch is not necessarily a home console. Since then, Nintendo has consolidated both their business and their strategies to one unified platform, and the reality is Nintendo handhelds have always sold better than their home console counterparts. And in terms of Nintendo handhelds, pretty much all of them, with one major exception, all of them have released in spring, or specifically March and April. The Game Boy was released in March, the Game Boy Advance was released in April, the 3DS was released in February in Japan, so March in North America and Europe, I believe, right? And then the Nintendo Switch was released in March as well. The only exceptions to that would be the Nintendo DS in November, and then the Game Boy Color, which you could count more as a revision, perhaps. Nintendo does, when they do their hardware sales, they lump it together with Game Boy. This, of course, is not counting for revisions, but this isn't a revision we're getting, this is a whole new console. The 2DS, that might release in October 2013 or something, right? And the 2DS XL, that released in, I think, July, right? But in terms of their new next generation portable devices, with the exception of the DS, once again, they've all released in that March timeframe. So given that track record, and given that Nintendo would likely want to replicate the success of the Switch, that alone, I feel like, is a pretty big reason for why they would choose to release the Switch 2 in March of 2025. Reason number 3, it is very likely based on other rumors as well as leaked documents from the Xbox FTC trial case when they were acquiring Activision. It is very likely we are getting a PS5 Pro and a new version of the Series X holiday 2024. PS5 Pro currently is strictly rumors, although based on the time frame, it's actually kind of weird we haven't already gotten a PS5 Pro at this point in the PS4's life cycle. We already had one, so that remains to be seen, although I would personally expect it. And then Xbox's Project Brooklyn, their new version of the Series X, that straight up was in documents that leaked during that trial, so we're most likely getting at least one piece of new hardware that isn't from Nintendo in 2024. The reason I bring this up and the reason I think this is noteworthy, Nintendo has historically never released hardware during the same period as its competitors, with the only exception to that rule in this millennium being the Nintendo Wii, which launched next to the PS3. Now, that's also worth mentioning in of itself because the Wii was, what, $200, maybe $250 if I'm remembering correctly? The PS3 was $600. So at that point, I'm sure Nintendo was like, okay, well, they're on completely different planes of existence. Whereas the PS5 Pro and a Nintendo Switch 2 will likely have a much smaller gap in pricing, and they would be direct competitors. Nintendo will aim to avoid conflict on store shelves for its first holiday season at all costs. And before I get comments about it, releasing in September does not prevent this. Releasing the Switch 2 before November does not prevent this. Either way, the first holiday season of this console would be going up against new hardware from potentially PlayStation and Xbox. They've only ever done that once. It worked out very well for them with the Wii, but the Wii and the PS3 were very vastly different in terms of price point. Reason number 4, I went back and looked at all of the codenames and announcements for Nintendo hardware, and going all the way back to the GameCube, the Dolphin, Nintendo has always, without fail, given their hardware at least 12 months from when they soft confirmed it with a codename to when they release it, usually longer than that. So the Dolphin, or the GameCube, was announced in May of 1999, released November 2001. The Nitro, or the DS, was announced in November 2003, released exactly 1 year later in November 2004. The Revolution, or the Wii, that was announced in June 2004. When do you know, it released in November 2006. The 3DS was revealed through a press release in March of 2010 and released in, I guess, late February, but once again early March for North America 2011. Project Cafe, or the Wii U, was confirmed in April 2011 and released in November 2012, and the NX was announced in March 2015 and released in March 2017. Nintendo has not officially acknowledged the existence of new hardware at all yet, unless you want to count them saying that Nintendo account stuff will carry forward to their next hardware, but that was definitely more of a general, like, hey, this is our future kind of outlook. It wasn't them saying, hey, this is our new code name for this hardware, it's going to release at some point, right? They haven't done anything like that yet, which is why I think a soft confirmation for the Switch 2 following their investor meeting in March, with a release 12 months later, lines up with what they've done for the past 2.5 decades. That cannot be understated. That is 25 years of raw, just like track record and pattern for how Nintendo announces their hardware. They could change that. They're not, beholden to that rule, but considering that is 6 consoles that they've done it with in a row, I really don't think they're just going to start changing that now. Let's talk about some sale numbers. So this is for the really nerdy among us that really enjoy Nintendo sales numbers and going through this information, as well as just the gaming industry as a whole. So the Switch is still selling exceptionally well in its 7th fiscal year on the market, continuing to match sales of its biggest competitor years into its life cycle. Just comparing the Switch to the PS5 from April 2022 to the end of March 2023, because Nintendo and Sony's fiscal years coincidentally line up, right? This is very interesting to me. In its 6th year on the market, the Switch sold 17.97 million units versus the PS5 in its 2nd full year on the market, selling 19.1 million. The PS5 is a new piece of hardware. At that point, the stock shortages were pretty much all resolved, and yes, that is less than the PS5, but for a console in its 6th year, that is insane, because the PS5 is currently outpacing, or at least at that point it was outpacing, the PS4 sale numbers, and the PS4 sold incredibly well. Like, it was breaking records for Sony. The PS5 has now been breaking records for Sony in terms of sell-through in a short time frame, and the Switch is almost matching that in its 6th year. The reason I bring this up is because I see a lot of comments saying that Nintendo can't handle another decline year over year for their hardware sales, and we're about to get even deeper into that, but this idea that the Switch is selling poorly is so overblown, it's not even really funny. The Switch is having another year of decline versus 2020 because of COVID, but the Switch itself is still selling comparable to new hardware that just released a couple of years ago. That's insane. But let's dive even deeper into those sales numbers. So we've noticed that there has been smaller percentage drops in hardware and software year over year versus previous Nintendo hardware. So for the Wii in its 6th to 7th fiscal year, there was a 60% drop in hardware. For the Switch, that same time frame, that drop was only 22%. That is a significantly less substantial drop in hardware sales. What's also kind of interesting is the Switch is actually holding better now in 2023 versus 2021 and 2022. For 2023, there was a 17% drop in hardware versus the previous year, versus a 21 and 22% drop in 2021 and in 2022. So year over year, the Switch has dropped substantially less than other Nintendo hardware. But let's talk about software, and I'll put this up on the screen so you can see it while I go through it, because talking numbers is kind of like word salad, right? There's just a lot of things being said. But the Wii, every year pretty much had a 40 to 50% drop until it was sunsetted, right? In its fiscal year 5 to 6, it dropped 40%, fiscal year 6 to 7, 50%, fiscal year 7 to 8, 48.3%. DS saw much lower drops year over year, but also worth noting, the DS is Nintendo's most successful handheld of all time, 23%, 20%, and then 49%. The 3DS, this one's actually interesting because they actually saw an increase due to Pokemon Sun and Moon, but 22.6% down, up 13.5%. That would have been 2016 when Pokemon Go and Sun and Moon happened. And then at fiscal year 7 to 8, there was a 35% drop as well. But then with Switch, these drops have been so substantially less, it's not even funny, dog. Fiscal year 5 to 6 went up 1%. Fiscal year 6 to 7, only down 8.9%. And then fiscal year 7 to 8, and this is the estimated numbers from Nintendo's financial briefing. This would be the year ending March 2024. They are estimating only a 13.5% drop in software sales. That is so... those are leagues different, right? The numbers for the software drops for the Wii and the DS and the 3DS in the 7th and 8th year of the console is so much higher than this 13.5% number that is estimated for the Switch. The Switch hardware and software, while they are going down year over year, that is undeniable, they are still doing exceptionally well. And on that note, first-party software is selling almost better than it ever has before in 2023. So in 2023, it had the second highest number of first-party sales units, which was around 100 million, second only to 2020, which once again was COVID, so numbers were completely inflated. So the fact that the chart for Switch first-party software has only gone up, yes, Nintendo profits off of their hardware, they profit more off of their software. So for Nintendo to release a new console right now, when their software is still climbing up year over year, with the only dip being from 2020, once again, because of COVID, that just doesn't make a lot of sense, right? They make the majority of their profit off of software, and, you know, yeah, they make revenue off of hardware as well, but when software is doing this well, when every game they release in major franchises are breaking records, right? We had Scarlet and Violet breaking records. Splatoon 3 broke records in Japan. Tears of the Kingdom, I think, broke records for fastest selling Nintendo game. Pikmin 4 is the best selling Pikmin game. Mario Wonder is the fastest selling Mario game, or at least from that week time frame we had, right? Software is selling better than ever, or at least it's close to selling better than ever. That is not the sign of a dying console. It just isn't. Something else I want to touch on is my theory or my prediction of the Switch 2 releasing in March 2025 would still mean releasing in the same fiscal year as holiday 2024. So a weaker holiday or 2024, if, you know, the software lineup isn't there, if the hardware drops even further, right? That weaker holiday season is remedied by a launch of the Switch 2 before the end of fiscal year 2024, right? And the fiscal year is what Nintendo will care about, because that is what investors care about. I've seen people argue with me that they're not going to go, what would it be, like 4 years at that point with declining hardware sales. I'm not arguing that they will, because I still think the Switch 2 is going to release in the same physical year that pretty much everyone else does. Releasing in September 2024 versus releasing in March 2025 doesn't really make a difference at the end of the day, in terms of what investors are wanting from Nintendo, and in terms of what Nintendo's bottom line will actually be, right? In fact, if anything, this is adding on here, releasing the Switch 2 in, let's say, September or November 2024, right, that will kill Switch 1 sales. And while the Switch 1 is selling worse and worse every year, it's still selling really well, right? We don't have Nintendo's estimates for what they will sell in 2024 yet, but in 2023, they estimated for that fiscal year to sell 15 million units. Now, it is speculated that we will get a new Pokemon game, a new Mario Party game, maybe a Mario Sports game. If they throw Metroid Prime 4 on top of that, maybe a Tomodachi Life game, right? These are all speculations, but Pokemon's really the only surefire thing there that you could expect in 2024. The Switch 1 will probably still sell at least 10 million units just based on a new Pokemon game alone. But if they release the Switch 2 in November, that is not going to happen. That just is not going to happen. The Switch 1 will completely die in that exact moment, and there would be no recovering, and the sales would just completely dry up. Versus releasing the Switch 2 in March 2025, you get one more holiday season to squeeze out as many Switches as possible. Maybe you do a price drop for the OLED down to $300. Maybe you do a price drop for the Switch Lite. Maybe you release a new Switch Lite OLED that comes in at $200, right? Maybe you do more aggressive bundling. There is still so many ways for them to have a strong holiday season with this existing hardware. Financially, it makes no sense for them to cut that off right here and now. It just doesn't. Wanted to include this also just because it is a little funny in the eyes of everything that's happening. Nintendo has outright denied all Switch 2 rumors and reaffirmed commitment to continuing to release new software on the Switch. This one, you know, people say, oh, Nintendo lies all the time. They really don't. The last time they did that, I think, was the 3DS XL, so they haven't even lied under Furukawa, but regardless, it is funny because they just have outright denied these things. This one might get me a lot of heat, but I do want to talk about it anyway. So there's a common sentiment online that the Switch's lineup so far announced for 2024, I'm recording this in early January, so this will change very soon. There's a lot of this sentiment going around that the Switch software lineup for this year is looking very poor. I actually think it's the exact opposite. I think the Switch software lineup this year is looking very strong, especially if you look at it from the perspective of this being potentially the Switch's last full year by itself on the markets. You know, when you look at other previous years of the Nintendo Switch generation, usually we don't know that much going into the following year, right? There was always those elusive titles like Tears of the Kingdom and Metroid Prime 4 and Bayonetta 3 and Shin Megami Tensei 5, right? But for the core games that release every year, we usually don't have the year kind of roadmaps out until February. And in the case of last year, we were worried about 2023 until June. There were articles going around about how Tears of the Kingdom was the final major Switch game up until June. And then that June Direct happened, and Mario Wonder was announced, Mario RPG was announced, and then we got another Direct announcing a new Princess Peach game, which, once again, I've made videos about this, I've talked about this in videos. I think that game could easily sell 5+ million copies. Luigi's Mansion 2 Remake sold, you know, the original version sold like 7 million, I believe, a little less than that on 3DS. Considering how well Luigi's Mansion 3 sold on Switch, I think it will probably outsell its 3DS counterparts, and then something like a Pokemon game, which isn't confirmed, but very likely based on precedence. That is a very strong year in terms of software sales. So this whole idea that it's a weak year, you know, maybe for your own personal taste, sure, but in terms of software sales and potential for Nintendo and for investors to be happy in 2024 without new hardware, they're releasing all the right games. And then the final thing I'm going to touch on in this video is that Nintendo may need an even longer marketing cycle to help differentiate this hardware more than they did for the Switch, as it is likely to be a relatively simple power boost, right? So the NX was announced in March 2015. And the Switch was actually revealed in October 2016. And because of that, a lot of people think that Nintendo will have a shorter marketing cycle for the Switch 2, right? Meaning they would announce it, let's say it comes out in September, they'll announce it in March, or April, or even May, or even June. I've seen people go as far as say it'll have like a 3-month marketing cycle where the Switch had, what, 5-6 months? But the reality is, even if you don't count the NX codename announcement, which, you know, most casual people don't know about that, even if you don't acknowledge that, the reality is the Switch had marketing for almost 3 full years before it came out. Breath of the Wild sold that console. That game was announced in 2014. The public knew that game was coming, and then it was a launch title for the Switch. So inadvertently, the Switch was marketed through Breath of the Wild for 3 full years. The Switch 2 does not have that same luxury. Metroid Prime is just a logo, and frankly, Metroid Prime is a niche franchise anyway. I would love if the Switch 2 is what catapults that series to success, but the reality is Metroid Prime has never sold that well. Zelda is something that has sold well in the past, and Breath of the Wild is what sold the Switch. So this idea that they'll have an even shorter marketing cycle to me just doesn't make sense unless they announce a 3D Mario game, like right now, they don't confirm the platform, and then, you know, that game has a full 12 months of marketing, but even still, that's less than what Breath of the Wild had. Coming off of their most successful console ever, right, they'll want to be very careful about release timing, and make sure they have a solid software pipeline ready for the first year. Releasing it in March simply helps ensure that software is ready, you know? People are assuming that Mario Kart and 3D Mario and this Ocarina of Time remake and all these games, we're just kind of assuming these games are ready. We don't know that. That's just complete conjecture that no one actually knows. Based on timeline, you can assume 3D Mario might be close to being done, but something like Mario Kart, they just got done doing the Booster Course Pass. Monolith Soft just released Xenoblade 3 and its massive DLC last year. The Zelda team just released Tears of the Kingdom last year. The 2D Mario team just released Mario Wonder last year. The idea that all of these developers are ready to go with new software for Switch 2 doesn't really make any sense. The only one that I could maybe see is like really ready to go outside of 3D Mario is Animal Crossing, because Splatoon 3 released in 2022, and I would assume it's been more of a skeleton crew making the DLC and content updates for that game, but that's not enough. And it's actually funny I have to say this because this is exactly what happened with the NX. Nintendo itself said, I believe, I'll put a quote up if I can find it, that the reason they released in March 2017 was because they wanted to ensure that software was ready and they would have a consistent rollouts of games. So starting with Breath of the Wild to Mario Kart 8 Deluxe to ARMS and Splatoon 2, right? They wanted to give themselves that extra half year to just make sure the software is ready. Who's to say they won't do that again? So to close off this video, I just want to say, right, one of my main issues with people loudly claiming it's coming in 2024 is that instead of looking at the data we have, like I just did, they're trying to piece together rumors from spotty insiders that have very bad track records, use predictions from analysts as confirmation, use things like Visions of Mana and Fantasy Life I not having a release date as evidence. These things aren't evidence. Fashion Dreamer and Paper Mario The Thousand Year Door having Super Famicom colored buttons, they aren't evidence. This is like confirmation bias where you just start seeing a pattern in things that isn't actually there and you start bundling them all together and you build it up in your mind of like, oh, well, all of these things have happened, so it must be true. But if you actually break them down piece by piece, none of them really make sense. Eurogamer reporting that Nintendo showed the hardware to developers at Gamescom 2023 could be true, absolutely, I will not deny that. But something like that does not indicate release timing. Bobby Kotick mentioning during the Xbox FTC court case that he'd been briefed on the hardware specs does not indicate release timing. Nvidia leaking the potential chips that are being used for the Switch 2 does not indicate release timing. It indicates that something exists. It indicates that the hardware is coming, but hardware is always coming. Nintendo is always working on the next thing. Everything I just went over is using data from Nintendo itself to form a reasonable conclusion on when this hardware will be released. I would love for it to come out in 2024. I am like one of the biggest Nintendo fans probably in the world. I eat, breathe, and sleep this crap, man. But it ain't happening, Chief. It just isn't. There's too much actual evidence and patterns suggesting otherwise. So with that being said, let me know your thoughts down in the comments below. I know I'm gonna get a lot of angry comments on this video, but I have noticed, you know, it's always that moving goalpost, right? In 2021, everyone was certain the Switch Pro was coming out, and then the OLED came out. And then even a year later, there were still people saying the Switch Pro would release in 2022. That obviously didn't happen. And then in 2023, I mean, there were other people calling me crazy for saying it wouldn't be announced in 2023. After Mario Wonder came out, and now their goalpost has been moved to 2024, and then eventually they'll just say 2025, and they get to be right in that moment. But I'm just tired of that goalpost moving. They will be right eventually, because eventually they will just say the exact release date. The moment, you know, July hits and this thing hasn't been announced, they'll just be like, oh, it's coming out in March 2025. Always said that. I always said it was coming out in March 2025. You know, I've never once said 2024. It's annoying. It is so funny to look back at my videos from 2022 and just seeing comments from people saying I'm insane for thinking it's not coming out in 2023. Like, dog, look at the actual data some more and try to form a reasonable conclusion. So until next time, of course, subscribe here for more Nintendo Switch news, reviews, coverage, all of that stuff. Follow me on Twitter at BoTalksGames, and until next time, peace.